So a couple of years ago, I decided to start cycling to work here at the British Museum. A few days in, whilst I was locking up, I noticed that there were some small, quite oddly shaped holes in the base of the wall by our bike racks. Now at first glance, they aren't particularly interesting, but for whatever reason, they piqued my curiosity and I started asking about them. Got a pretty quick response: bomb damage caused during the Blitz. My follow-up question, however, was a little harder to answer, because if we were damaged during the Blitz, what happened to the objects that were supposed to be here? Now, in order to find out that answer, I had to comb through the many archives and object storerooms of the British Museum. In front of me, I've assembled a couple of the items I've come across, putting them together in a neat little prototype of a display case that, if I'm totally honest, I'd quite like to see installed in one of our galleries. Because it not only tells one of the most interesting periods in the British Museum's 270-year history, it's also, I think, its most significant contribution to history. So as this year marks the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, it seems about time to share that story. I'm Nick Harris, this is my display case, and it tells the story of the British Museum during the Second World War.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
On the 3rd of September 1939 at 11:15, Chamberlain declared war on Germany. Chamberlain's words would have echoed through the halls and galleries of the British Museum, his voice's resonance amplified by the fact that the place was practically empty. The galleries were closed to the public, and even if they could turn up, there wasn't very much there, their contents having already been evacuated to the safe havens of nearby tube stations and distant country houses. And somehow, museum staff had managed to do this in the 8 days immediately leading up to Chamberlain's declaration of war. In those 8 days, they managed to move over 150 tons of objects. And it's not just the volume of objects, it's the variety of objects that they had to move that's quite so impressive. Everything from Shakespeare's first folios to Anglo-Saxon metalwork and coins and Ice Age ivories, all safely out of the firing line of Nazi bombers. So how was the British Museum so prepared to evacuate their objects? Well, that's what this first section of the display covers. And like any great feat of British administration, they followed a handbook, conveniently titled Air Raid Precautions in Museums, Picture Galleries and Libraries, which was published by us in 1939. Now, the book is split into 3 distinct sections. The first 2 are written by the UK government and aren't really relevant to our story today. Chapter 3 is the chapter actually written by the British Museum. It is very, very short. It's only 13 pages long, and it is full of illustrative little diagrams telling you how to secure objects if you cannot move them out of your building or even your galleries, and how to secure and protect them if you were to take them elsewhere. Now, this chapter was written by the 2 people you will hear me speak most about throughout this story. Director of the British Museum, Sir John Forsdyke, who was in charge of the logistics and the execution of the British Museum's evacuation, and by all accounts was a bit of a control freak, and refused to listen to anyone other than his counterpart, the first chemist to work in almost any museum in the world, Dr. Harold Plenderleith, who wrote the other part of this chapter. And it boils down to, more or less, you must consider 4 factors if you are going to try and save your objects from aerial bombardment. You must prioritize your objects to work out which you must get out fastest. You must be able to work at speed because of that. You must be able to protect your objects that are housed somewhere underground from things like damp, and if you house them above ground, you must be able to protect them from fire. So let's deal with that last element first, fire. I think it's a fairly well-known fact that almost every librarian in the world has woken up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat at some point thinking about the fire of the Great Library of Alexandria. And that fear has continued through to the modern age. The British Museum had employed their own firefighting staff for almost a century at this point in time. These firemen warders would protect the museum from an inevitable outbreak of fire, using water where necessary, but in instances where they didn't need to, using buckets of sand. So, in preparation for the Second World War, Sir John Forsdyke increased the number of firemen warders we had on site and gave them some additional training so they could deal with incendiary devices and explosives, and added to their equipment list with a steel helmet and also a golf club. And this is genuinely what British Museum staff were given to fight off the Luftwaffe. As much as dealing with fire was an issue, we also had to think even harder about water. In fact, Forsdyke is quoted as saying that destruction by mildew is slower but no less certain than that by bombs. So how did he know this? Well, we had some experience with it, specifically this object in a post office tunnel at the end of 1918. Unlike most other countries in the First World War, the UK experienced aerial raids in the First World War as well. It was like the Blitz, only it was with Zeppelins. And by 1918, the situation had got so severe, the UK government demanded that the major museums in London start protecting their most precious objects. We were given a post office tunnel to use, but it was quite inaccessible for large objects, so we sandbagged them where they stood. Those that were deemed small enough and important enough to bury underground were put in the post office tunnel, including this little guy here. And whilst our sandbagged objects were perfectly fine by the end of the war, when these came back up, they'd suffered serious damage due to damp. This object in particular, around the face, had suffered something called efflorescence, which is in essence objects that contain any kind of soluble salt within them, if exposed to huge fluctuations in relative humidity, can form breakages. When humidity levels are high, soluble salts dissolve. When they're low, they re-solidify, and this kind of movement runs the risk of forming cracks and breakages in the otherwise very solid objects. But even in minor situations, like with cuneiform tablets, the salts coming to the surface can make that object entirely unreadable. This, along with other problems caused by the damp in the post office tunnel, like active corrosion and mildew and mould, was a bit beyond the skill set of the British Museum at the time. This is a time before scientists are employed in places like museums. So these people are entirely stumped. But they're brave enough to ask for outside help. The government bring in a consultant, a recently retired chemist by the name of Dr. Alexander Scott. Now, he has three really significant characteristics at this point in time. 1, very accomplished chemist. 2, retired, so has lots of free time. And 3, he's an art lover and lover of history. So he seems like the perfect person for the job. He spends a couple of months assessing the British Museum's problem and comes to the conclusion that a scientific lab set up specifically to fix these objects needs to be established. He first fixated on trying to work out a way that we might have stored things safely in the post office tunnel. His philosophy being that if we could work out those extreme conditions, we could make everything in this relatively easy building a lot safer. The other thing that Scott does is he very quickly gets inundated with letters from all around the world. They send actual objects to Scott, and in every instance, he agrees to do the work and to do it for free. His philosophy being that we need to learn from every example we can have so we are better armed with science to protect the arts. And these two principles are what he instills in his immediate successor in 1923, Dr. Harold Plenderleith. So, Plenderleith carries on Scott's legacy, and he starts developing more and more sophisticated ways of protecting objects from the elements. It involved machinery, it involved relative humidity checks, and a whole plethora of other tools. But by the time we got to 1939, we could convert just about anything into the perfect environment for objects. So this was another key moment in the British Museum's preparations for war. At this point in time, we know how to protect our objects from fire, and we know how to protect them from damp, which is great for when we eventually evacuate them, but we still need to work out a means of getting them there and what we're sending. The earliest and easiest preparation was to prioritise which objects needed to be evacuated first. I think it's worth taking a moment just to hear how one particular department decided to prioritise those objects, because it shows the weight that the staff were feeling on their shoulders at this point in time. In the drawing up of the original list, it has been our endeavour to take an international view and to include such things as would be a world loss. While this remained a binding principle, it was afterwards possible to have regard to the practical irreplaceability, so far as the museum was concerned, of large parts of the collection. And eventually, we were able to include in our evacuation lists some representative of every part of the collections. So, priority was, what is the greatest loss for the world? Then what's the greatest loss for the British Museum? And then, can we represent a little bit of everything where possible? So after making these difficult decisions, the British Museum now knew what it wanted to evacuate. It just needed to work out how it was going to do that. And this is where John Forsdyke really took charge. One of the biggest barriers in the 1930s for a museum trying to evacuate their stuff is the fact that almost all crates they can get their hands on are nailed together and are delivered fully assembled, which means they take up a monumental amount of space. So, in order to combat this, you would have to pre-order them and kind of hope they would arrive on the day, which left you very susceptible to anything going wrong. John Forsdyke, being the control freak that he was, did not want anything to do with this and wanted every supply of every material he could possibly need on site well ahead of an evacuation. And Forsdyke's solution was this nifty little device. Okay, clearly this is a homemade model, but whilst we were editing this video, it became apparent that explaining how a box works without an actual box doesn't really work. So just bear with me. This is a no-nails box, a product that was revolutionising the shipping industry in the 1930s. Made of plywood and held together in the corners with flexible metal banding, it could be flat-packed, much like IKEA furniture is today, and assembled in less than a minute. A little less like IKEA furniture. The way that they worked was you would take the base, fit your flexible carcass over the top of it, delicately fill it with your objects, and then place the lid on top, which would add extra rigidity. You would then use steel banding around the box to hold it in place, and it became as indestructible as any other crate available on the market. However, the huge advantage was they arrived flat packed and took up just a fraction of those traditional crates the museum had previously been using. The room I'm standing in now, at some point in 1939, was full with over 3,300 of these flat pack cases. And this was primarily what we used to get our objects out of the museum. He also made agreements with various railway stations to deliver objects from the museum to their various safe houses. So he demanded from the railway lines to be delivered railway carts to take directly to the train stations. They should be left on the British Museum site. So we know which objects we want to evacuate, we know how to move them at speed, and we know that we can look after them wherever we put them. Where did we decide to put them? We chose two above-ground storage solutions, Drayton and Boughton House, both miles from London and well away from any location the Nazis were likely to want to target. We also had two underground storage solutions. There was Aldwych Tube Station, which we had already fitted with hydrometers, air conditioning, dehumidifiers and ventilation. We also had the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth, where we were, with them, building a secret climate-controlled underground bunker in the cliffside next to the library. We were about as prepared as we could be. John Forsdyke received a call from Whitehall on the evening of August 23rd. The government said, "Evacuate your objects, war is imminent." 7 a.m. the following day, museum staff were here and started packing almost immediately.
This country is at war with Germany.
On the 3rd of September 1939, Chamberlain declared war on Germany. And then, nothing really happened. The expectation was days, maybe a week, before the capital was just overrun with Nazi bombers. But the truth of the matter is not a single bomb dropped on London for over a year. Despite the fact no bombs are being dropped on the UK at this point in time, museum staff are still having to actively look after the collection. This document here is probably the clearest example of that. This is the relative humidity and temperature in the tube tunnel throughout the war. And two guys were stationed there to do 12-hour shifts each and had to sleep down there. And by all accounts, it was terrible. But they are doing the best that they can, and they are kind of experimenting. During the winters, the temperature seems to drop quite dramatically, as does the humidity, which, as we know, can damage objects. So they are placing hot wet towels and then cold wet towels on the floor in an attempt to raise the humidity. They are ad hoc solutions, but they're definitely working. And this is the first bit of damage we can see to the museum on just the second day of Nazi bombing in London, only 371 days after Chamberlain's declaration of war. The label by Sydney Smith reads, "This pebble was picked up on the floor of the 3rd Egyptian room on Monday, September 9th, 1940. It had fallen through the glass skylight and hit the top of a wooden screen. It must have been blown out of Russell Square by the explosion of a delayed action bomb at 7:40 a.m. Other such pebbles were found in the mess room in the basement and by the keeper of printed books outside his room. But this one pebble achieved a record flight." Sydney Smith, September 9th, 1940. What I like to think is that he was just trying to keep himself entertained and his spirits up, and he probably did this more to make fun of his friends and brag that he found the furthest flying pebble than any of the colleagues he mentions in the label. The first bomb to directly hit the museum was an 1,000-kilo explosive that went through 6 ceilings and floors and ended up in one of our sub-basements. Miraculously, it didn't explode because its igniter was in the tail of the bomb, which had been pulled off by an iron girder as it plunged through the building. Only 6 days later, a second bomb fell on the museum and also didn't explode, and somehow also went through all the same holes caused by the first bomb. This was, without doubt, John Forsdyke's favourite ever anecdote about the museum. He said, "This was a unique event appropriately occurring in a museum. However, it is ironically unprovable with any physical evidence." It was still good spirits. These would soon change slightly when the bomb started having a more dramatic effect on the museum. The era of relative peace has come to an end, and you can see that in the minutes for this trustees meeting on the 9th of November 1940. For a start, the only person who can turn up is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and presumably whoever had to take the minutes for this meeting. Now, in it you can see itemised some of the problems the museum is now facing. We can see some of the first real damage to the museum. The newspaper archive we had in Colindale was hit and we lost 30,000 volumes. Much more pertinently, 39 Russell Square is demolished, which is Plenderleith's science lab. It's absolutely demolished. And from there, the attacks only intensified. The night of May 10/11 resulted in the highest number of casualties of any night of the Blitz in London. It was absolutely devastating. Almost 1,500 people lost their lives, almost 11,000 people lost their homes. This is a B1E cluster incendiary device. It's about 1 kilo, and its main and only job was to set fire to anything and everything in its path. You can see that it's been used. This is why the ends exploded out. This is a great heat that is eventually kind of ruptured from it and then spread out along the building in an attempt to set it on fire. And on the night of May 10/11, we were hit with enough of these to keep us alight for 11 hours. The first bombs ignited the museum at around 11:40 p.m. And from there, fires continued. The fires raged so fiercely and for so long, every single person living on the British Museum site was called to fight on the roofs. And this included Harold Plenderleith and Sir John Forsdyke. I could try and tell you this story, but I think the genuinely most impactful and most honest version of this is recounted by one of our firemen warders.
At 11:33 p.m. we were in the watchroom, and when we heard a report and the crackling sound of incendiary bombs, the firemen dispersed to the lower roof, where they got a length of hose to work on the new Parthenon roof. Whereupon I noticed that the top floor of number 6A Bedford Square was alight, and realising that I probably had more danger threatening the museum, I gave the order to call the London Fire Brigade to that fire. At the same time, we received a call from both posts to incendiaries on the roof. Proceeding along the North Road with Sinclair, we attacked a couple of incendiary bombs, and turning into the East Road, I saw a bomb and attacked the same, while Sinclair attacked one on the laboratory. Back at the watchroom, I was informed that the roof of the Roman Britain gallery was on fire. Getting back to the roof, I found a fire spreading westward. At 12:58, I sent a message back that the key position of the museum was well alight and further immediate assistance was necessary. At that time, I swung all my water from the roof to hold the Iron Library, and during this time, the fire proceeded westward, and at the same time, I saw that the Coins and Medals department was well alight. At 3:50 a.m, a message was received from a London Fire Brigade officer that the fire was spreading northwards of the coin room, and that he considered that it was too dangerous for men to work there. I proceeded to the roof, and with my own staff was able to hold the fire from the third vase gallery.
Some of the offices and departments that did still have objects in them were also set ablaze, and you can see the impact of that to the Department of Coins and Medals in front of me. These are two piles, or were once two piles of medieval coins. One British medieval, the other Indian medieval. These two absolute messes of coins serve as a visual reminder of what could have happened had Plenderleith and Forsdyke not fought so hard to evacuate the museum collection in the first place. And they would continue to make that fight. As Nazi air raids spread further and further across the UK, some of our safe houses started being less safe. And so Forsdyke and Plenderleith look at everything they've achieved thus far and come to a singular conclusion. We need a large underground storage facility, and that is the only way we will protect this collection. They start looking for a suitable location. They find a quarry. It's currently being used to culture mushrooms, which means it's very, very damp. But Plenderleith thinks he can dry it out and make it appropriate. The quarry is sealed off with 2 bomb-proof doors that were requisitioned from a bank, and as far as museum rumour is concerned, the climatic and humidity control engine was a requisitioned U-boat engine. It was ad hoc at best, but apparently the temperature and humidity never dropped more than a degree above or below where they should be. In fact, it was so perfect that when the war finally ended in 1945, it had gone from being a last-ditch attempt to save those collections to being the best possible option for an extended period of time. And when the objects finally returned, John Forsdyke sat down to write an account of what had been achieved and how it had been achieved during the Second World War. And he ends this account with a note about this very handbook. In reading these pages now, one finds nothing except the protection against poison gas that might not have been written in the light of experience after the war. In essence, they got everything right. So John Forsdyke retired not long after publishing that article, but I think it would be a bit remiss not to mention one of his final acts as director of the British Museum. For the final 2 years, he was on a personal campaign to raise funds to start microfilming the collection, a technology that was in its infancy at this point in time. He had seen what could happen to the collections in the British Museum, and he decided that there was this new technology that could be used to both preserve in a different medium and also more widely spread the collection that was once just accessible here. And as for Harold Plenderleith, not long after the end of the Second World War, he started work on what would become the first and quintessential book on conservation. He went on to found multiple international organisations dedicated to the conservation of objects around the world. And he is widely referred to now as the father of conservation as a result of this. He is, in many ways, the reason that today, the British Museum can proudly say we have the longest running scientific lab in the world in any museum. Now, this would be the ending point for the story, but we did get a little letter through the post in the 1980s from someone who was taking over our old quarry in Westwood. It is a small cuneiform inscription, but don't worry, we didn't leave anything behind. This has nothing to do with ancient Mesopotamia. This is instead been written by an Englishman in a quarry in 1942. And it reads, "In that year, everything precious, the works of all the craftsmen, which were sent out from palaces and temples, we brought down and stored in this cavern under the earth, a place of safety, an abode of quiet, so that they might not perish by fire and the stroke of an evil enemy." This was written by one of our Assyriologists, Cyril Gadd, who was stationed in the quarry through the remainder of the latter half of the Second World War. Sadly, you can't even go and visit this inscription anymore, as it has been destroyed in the multiple uses and reuses of Westwood Quarry. However, if you would like to see another weird set of oddly shaped signs on a wall, take a little time to look at the holes in the wall by our bike racks, because they are the one physical reminder of the logistical genius of Sir John Forsdyke, of the trailblazing conservation of Plenderleith, and of the bravery of our golf club wielding fireman warders.